Okay, well, good day, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you all are. I'm Eric Hartman. I'm editor at globalsl.org and assistant professor at Kansas State. I'm just going to introduce a little bit about what's happening here today, what globalsl.org is, and some of the tools that we have at our disposal. And actually, before I do that, Marianne, could you wait until you're presenting?
Okay, sorry.
That screen share, no
Sorry
problem.
about
So you'll just have to toggle over the same spot and end the sharing for the moment. So I'm just going to do a little bit of overview of Global SL, but also some technical issues. So the first technical issue to be aware of is we are recording this, so be aware that you're being recorded. Also, you have the capacity to mute your microphone. If you toggle over the screen, it's on the bottom left. So we ask if you're not speaking to try to eliminate background noise from what can be more than 30 different presenters or discussants that you mute while you're not speaking. We do encourage interaction. That's one of the central themes of Global SL webinars. So as we get to the last hour of the presentation, by all means, unmute, speak, contribute. And also during the presentation, one of the things you have access to, if you scroll over the bottom part of your screen, you'll see a bar there where there's a chat button. So you can click that chat button and you can send a chat to everyone that pops up and everyone can see, or you can send a chat individually once you have that group chat box open to different individuals. Okay, so those are some of the, and I'll cover a couple more technical issues at the end here. But in the meantime, welcome. Global SL, if you do not know it or are not familiar with it, supports best practice global learning and cooperative development. It does that by amassing research online, sharing teaching tools, and working to create spaces for conversation. We're very interested in creating spaces for conversation. We attempt to do that through blog posts. Many of you have been guest bloggers, and we appreciate that, and we invite other guest bloggers to find people mobilize their research in this way and connect with other researchers and practitioners and move their projects forward. We have a global engagement survey, globalsl.org/GES, if you're interested in participating, but we use it as, in many ways, as a tool to stimulate conversation on best practices as you look at institutions' successes or challenges in terms of encouraging global learning with their programming organizations as well. And finally, through our webinars. So here we are on one such webinar. Thank you for joining. Today, we'll have another webinar coming up on March 2nd on ethical frameworks in international volunteering and service learning. You'll hear a little bit about that later today. It's also just been posted this morning on the website, so if anyone's interested, just go to the blog site. And finally, we do summits, institutes. We're part of convening the 4th International Service Learning Summit that's coming up this fall, October 23rd, 25th at Kansas State University. We're getting a little bit of background noise. What I was saying earlier is if you're not speaking, if you could scroll over the bottom left and click mute on your screen, that would help limit background noise for everybody. So again, thank you for being here. And please contribute and share and help us see many people we speak with. Many people we speak with actually sorry, I took a pause there. Actually just muted everyone. Now, you all still have the freedom to unmute yourselves, but you'll have to do that before you speak. So again, that's on the bottom left to do that. So again, thank you for being here. We grow as a network by people providing us with ideas to mobilize conversations. So as you have them, please share them. There's been a lot of momentum in that way, and clearly as more and more international volunteering and study abroad is happening and is encouraged, there's also more and more concern about how to do it well, and that's where so many of your contributions are really needed. Just want to make sure I've mentioned everything about the platform we're on. You may be looking at the speaker view or the gallery view. In the top right of your screen, there's something you can click on where you can either in the gallery view basically see most of the people on the call, or speaker goes to the voice, the noise, in this case me, at each moment. The chat function, again, scrolling over the bottom, as well as the mute. All your controls will pop up as you scroll over the bottom of the screen. And one of the nice things, we have an opportunity here, as the presenters are speaking, if you don't want to interrupt, but if you have an idea or question, please drop it into the chat space. So again, click on that chat icon in the bottom and just start conversation there. We're really fortunate to have a whole team today. And Noel, who I'll introduce in a second, is going to be watching that chat space and looking for particular questions as we move through the conversation. So I want to thank very much Marianne Larson, Jessica Arens, Samantha Deere, Sam Deere, Gonzalo Duarte, and Nora Reynolds, as well as Noel Habashi for joining us here today. Sorry, just making a note there. Marianne, you might want to get your background, your PowerPoint up now, and just so everyone knows where people are coming from, Marianne is Marianne Larson's editor of the book we're talking about today, and an associate professor in the Faculty of Education at Western University in Ontario, Canada. Jessica Arens is a chapter contributor to that book, International Service Learning, Engaging Host Communities, and a faculty engagement associate at SUNY Binghamton. Sam Deere, many of you probably first came into contact with the Sharp and Deere article a couple of years ago in the Michigan Journal. She's a chapter contributor, associate director of Alive Outdoors, which is an experiential and outdoor education company in Toronto, based in Toronto. Gonzalo Duarte is a chapter contributor and executive director of Compañeros, a social enterprise dedicated to respectful volunteer service and cross-cultural learning. Nora Reynolds, also a chapter contributor, executive director of Water for Waslala, an organization that supports water access in the municipality of Waslala, Nicaragua, and director of evaluation with globalsl.org. And Noel Habashi is a doctoral student at Penn State University with a lot of experience in this area, who's focusing his dissertation on host community impacts as well. Janice McMillan is director of the Global Citizenship Education Program at University of Cape Town and has also published widely in this area and worked with Stanford's program in Cape Town for many, many years, contributed a lot in that area. So I will sit back as the rest of the contributors step forward here, and I think Janice is going to facilitate as needed between, we'll lead us off with the questions after the presenters share their information. And Marianne, you could go ahead and let us know about the background of the book and your main insights.
So, first of all, thank you so much, Eric, for organizing this, and thank you to the other authors who've managed to make some time in their busy schedules to be here. I am so excited to talk about the book, some of the findings from the book, the significance of it, and share that with you and hear some of your questions and insights as well. First of all, can you see my PowerPoint slide?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Just wanted to make sure that that was working. So the book itself is called International Service Learning, Engaging Host Communities, and it really started from a place where I was investigating the potential of ISL, GSL programs to create students as global citizens. And I noticed in my own research that most of the focus was in the research literature was on the students themselves and looking at the outcomes of the courses with respect to student learning and student learning outcomes. And I began to think and wonder about the host communities. There didn't seem to be as much literature in that area. We didn't seem to know that much about their perceptions, the impact of these programs on them. So in the course of wondering, I found a number of people who actually were doing research in this area. And some of the research was done by doctoral students in their dissertations. So some of the chapters are written by students who conducted studies to do with host communities for their doctoral work. And other research was just coming out. It hadn't been published yet. So I managed to put together a group of authors. And the objectives for the book, if you can see on the slide here, there were three main objectives that we set out when writing this book and editing the book. The first objective was to problematize the impact and influence of ISL programs on individuals and groups in communities in the Global South. And we acknowledge that most of the programs that we were looking at, in fact, all of them, involved North American students going to Global South communities. The second objective for the book was to legitimize and privilege the voices, the experience, and the values of those in those host communities. And the third piece, which I believe is probably, if not the most important, one of the key objectives of the book, and that was to say, okay, here's what we know. What are the possibilities now for rethinking some of the somewhat problematic aspects of the relations between host communities, ISL students, ISL facilitators and providers, and so on, in favor of new relations based on principles such as reciprocity, interdependence, relationship, solidarity, and mutuality. So the book included I don't have the number here right now. I'm going to say 16 authors off the top of my head, but you see some pictures of some of them up there. It was really exciting because we were able to bring together authors from North America, Canada, and the United States, as well as authors and writers from Nicaragua, Ghana, Haiti, Kenya, and Uganda. And what was, I think, very important in terms of this book was to break down that idea that the knowledge that counts is the knowledge that just comes out of the ivory tower. In other words, we have chapters that are authored by practitioners, people who run organizations and facilitate ISL trips. We have chapters written by people in the field in Nicaragua and other countries who facilitate those programs. And the idea here is that we're saying those voices, their opinions, their experiences are just as important as that which comes out of academia. The book is organized into two main sections. The first section contains a set of case studies. There are 8 case studies. 4 of them involve countries in Central America, and 4 involve countries in Africa. In other words, students, North American students going to countries in Central America and Africa. And then in the second half of the book is chapters to do with where do we go from here, the new possibilities. The final chapter, the concluding chapter, basically sums it all up and includes some ideas that Jen Kozak and myself had about a paradigm shift that we believe is important in terms of rethinking completely the paradigm upon which ISL relationships are based. That's really all that I'm going to say as an introduction. I'm not sure what you'd like now. Eric, people I assume have read my introduction to the book, and perhaps we can open it up to the other authors.
Absolutely. I think I can't remember the exact order, but I'll let the authors, Jessica, Aaron, is Jessica on the call? I know Sam and Nora with us here. But in any case, perhaps Sam, you could unmute yourself and share a little bit about your chapter and what you learned.
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. I guess, I'm coming into this as a little bit of a young gun in the field, and, was one of those students who were working on changing. I was a student who wanted to go and change the world back about 15 years ago. And what happened was, to be completely transparent, I went down to Haiti with this assumption and had my assumptions totally disrupted through actions, through words of locals. And it ended up, as we know, the best thing that could have happened to me and all the students or participants that we facilitate on these programs. I went back to school conflicted, trying to figure out my place in this world, and I came across the word reciprocity. And at first that word was, great. This is a great word. It's clear now, mutual benefit. But what I studied and what the chapter was really about was reactions to how people understood reciprocity from the mentality of service providers in and around the Toronto area. So what I mean by service providers are third-party providers that are offering international experiences, some with service projects and some without, for young people aged 15 to 30. And when I started to ask them, what does reciprocity mean to you? It was apparent that it was understood in many, many different ways, from financial pieces of financials being left behind to tangible results being left behind, to those who were strongly opposed to the leave behind mentality of reciprocity and saw reciprocity only as education. And basically what I came to acknowledge is that, reciprocity was super messy, and in turn then was introduced to a term of interdependence, which I feel is quite well articulated by Lila Watson, who says, if you've come here to help me, you're wasting your time. But if your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together. And, and since then with the chapter, my work at Alive Outdoors, we work with a number of high schools in and around Toronto, and maybe some of the teachers that we're working with is on this call right now. But what we do is we facilitate outdoor experiences in relationship to character development. And what I'm sort of toying with right now is the idea that there's no right way, in a sense, to understand reciprocity or interdependence or to do service. Building something, financial donations, or going to learn is all right and it's all wrong, depending on the context. But what I am sure of now is that character education piece, and I'm sure, for lack of better words, character education piece is something that is arguably not seen as very important for people going overseas without a professional skill. So what I mean by that is understanding vulnerability as a strength, the ability to listen, deconstructing that ego of save the world. And so what the chapter really is about at the end is obviously shifting to a more relational based approach to ISL, which we've all are talking about, but also then how are we going to do that? And questions that I'm toying with now is how can we shift that paradigm, and how can we actually, what is the best way to teach the power of vulnerability as a strength, and to drop that ego, and to have participants go down and learn these crucial character development skills. However, with service providers, not have them use that as an excuse to just have students go down as tourists and continue this product mentality of what we're dealing with here. So that's a little bit of an overview from my end.
Thank you very much, Sam. I just dropped a hopefully purposefully provocative question into the chat in a way to remind people that the chat is there, and to have us thinking about some things we might talk about later. I'm also going to just briefly unmute. There are a couple of people on who have joined us from telephones, and I can't see who they are. So just wanted to check and see if Jessica Ahrens is on the phone line.
Yes, Eric, can you hear me?
Absolutely. Glad.
Okay. Yeah, I'm sorry I couldn't get on via the web, but I'm here by phone.
Okay, great. Well, are you ready to share about your chapter?
Yes, absolutely. So what I'll do is just give a little bit of background about my case study, what I learned, and then some questions that I still have in case that's helpful for folks. And I apologize, I can't see the chat box, but feel free to field those questions in as well. So I too was very motivated by this question of what is the community partner's perspective, and how that was really missing in the literature. So as a graduate student, I designed a case study to help really create a platform for community partner voices. And I had the great fortune of being able to travel to Africa and live for a month in a home for street children and youth. And at this particular center, there's 3 universities that come and are hosted. And when I was there, I interacted with about 78 faculty and students. And one class in particular, I was sort of a TA for, so I also facilitated student reflection in the evening. But at the end of the month, when I had been working alongside with residents and volunteers, I then asked 18 of the staff, volunteers, and residents to be interviewed, and 11 of them consented. So I did a qualitative study on some of the impacts of service learning from these 3 universities. And I'll just say, as far as what I learned, plus I have some content that I highlight in the chapter, but I also want to talk briefly about process. I come from a critical background as a critical scholar, and I think it was really great to have some sensitivity about an outsider coming into a community, but I really had sort of a preoccupation with not being able to access the real story. I was really concerned that people wouldn't be willing to really share truthfully what they were feeling about the partnership. And really the opposite happened. People were tremendously candid and very eager to share their experiences, both positive and negative. So I want to throw that out there in case anybody's thinking about designing a similar project or doing similar research. Just going out and trying and asking people how things are can be very effective. So as far as content goes, there was a few benefits that were mentioned. The monetary support that the students provided was by far the most commonly cited benefit of the programs. Many people said that if it wasn't for the students, the center couldn't function financially. And affection, so the attention that we gave the orphan children was also seen as a huge benefit. But for the purpose of this chapter, I really wanted to focus on the negative impacts because I think those are much lesser known. The first of which was stereotypes, which was reported on both sides amongst the community partners, but also the students. So they felt that each group was stereotyping each other and really expecting certain types of behavior based on culture or based on race. The second category was entitlement. Some of the residents felt that they were privileged to not follow the rules because they were with American students, and the staff really saw that as a huge problem. And the students also felt a certain level of entitlement as far as the conditions of their living quarters. And one student actually said, I've been a tourist in developing countries, but here I'm here to serve. And so I feel like my treatment and level of respect should be a little bit better than just that of a tourist. And then the third category was exploitation, which I thought was really interesting, which was sort of a positive and a negative. The center exploited the presence of white people out in the community in order to garner more support, which I thought was really interesting. So when they went out and asked for funding or volunteers, the local community said, well, if there's white people supporting this, then why not me? So it kind of elevated the organization's status in their eyes, which I thought was really interesting. But it also became a deterrent for support. Some people said, well, if you have busloads of foreigners coming in, then why are you asking me for money? So there was this assumption there that the center was financially okay because of these relationships with foreigners. But exploitation also took the form of community members feeling exploited as research partners. They said, oftentimes we feel like we're just collecting data for the white guys. And there was no sort of recognition or compensation for that work. So I thought that was clearly an example of sort of post-colonial notions informing the current relationships. And then there was also sexual exploitation. There were romantic relationships that came up, and some of the women students felt like their personal space was being violated. So those are just some of the negative impacts that I was able to record. So as far as questions go, one question I have is, amongst this discussion of pre-departure orientation that Eric had mentioned and Marianne as well, and thinking about how to make the program stronger, how to do best practices, I think we've really gained a lot of momentum, and those aspects of our programs have become more robust, so students can deal with things like the stereotyping and the entitlement and some of the character development that Sam was getting at. But I wonder about those aspects of global service learning that are outside of our control, especially in post-colonial societies. So how can we tend to, or at least acknowledge, the kind of impact, whether it's positive or negative, our mere presence is having in these communities? Because that isn't something that we can just train students to do better. It's a perception within the community that we really don't have control over. And then lastly, my last question is, are the short-term benefits of these programs worth those longer-term, potentially harmful aspects? So for example, if me as a community member, I'm more willing to give money to an organization because I see the foreign support, is that okay, even though that's capitalizing on a colonialistic notion? And, sort of furthering that idea that because white people are invested in something, I should as well. So those are just two questions to pose and sort of a summary of my chapter.
Thank you very much, Jessica. And we do have a few people joining by phone, so Noel's task of sifting through these questions and giving them voice at particular moments is especially important later today. One thing I might have chatted in is about how you think that experience and research relates to the growing literature concerned about orphanage volunteerism in particular. We can table that for later. So Nora, could you share a little bit about your chapter, and then we'll have Gonzalo, and then we'll jump into some questions.
Absolutely. And I'm looking at some of the questions in the chat box, and there's some good ones coming through, so I'll try not to get distracted by them and head down those paths, but I think there's lots to discuss. So similar to Jessica, I'll try to just give a very brief why this chapter, why the book, how I came to this work, what I learned through the process, and a few lingering questions, and then hand it over to Gonzalo. So I think the why the book, why I came to this chapter in the book, we heard from others, and especially Marianne setting the tone about this gap in the scholarship and the literature. That's kind of the, the professional or the academia reason of why, but I think all of us really come from these personal stories of how did we get involved in this work, and that's really often, I think, or always probably our motivation. And like Sam shared, I too was that student who, got to have a 2-week experience the week after graduation from college that fundamentally shaped and transformed my personal and professional paths. And so often my community partners in Nicaragua, when I start asking critical questions about international volunteers, will shoot right back at me and say, well, you got to do it, so careful being so critical as you ask these questions. And I think many of us probably come from similar experiences. But subsequently, to kind of share what my positionality was with this chapter is, from that experience, I co-founded an NGO working for water access in a rural municipality of Nicaragua, and have worked on that through till today, so 2002 until 2016 at present. And we have a team of 5 Nicaraguans working on the ground in Nicaragua, and we have built water systems in 17 communities that are serving over 6,000 people to date. So I've stayed very involved in this community and worked with our current director, Junior, since 2004. And when I embarked on my dissertation research, I wanted to start digging into this question of sharing other perspectives and other voices in these partnerships and relationships. And I felt this real discomfort because I felt like I came to the work in some ways as the community partner who then embarked on a PhD, and often was sitting at tables or in presentations and would be hearing conversations about how do we get community partners to share perspectives and things, and thinking, well, I'm kind of the community partner, but we're sitting here talking about how community partners don't want to be a part of research or don't want to share those voices and those perspectives, or how do you access those voices? And sometimes those questions are very telling in and of themselves. So that led to my dissertation research, which was looking at the perspectives in Wasalla, Nicaragua, about a 10-year partnership with Villanova's College of Engineering. And when I published my first article out of my dissertation, I translated it and sent it back to Junior, my longtime coworker and colleague and friend. And I felt really uncomfortable when I sent him the translated version. And now he had looked at my findings. He had given me feedback. He had been a part of this process since the very beginning, but yet it was only my name on the article, and it made me really uncomfortable. And I realized this discomfort with the lack of participation at the dissemination stage of research. And that really was what led to this chapter in many ways. So he wrote back, his reflections, his feedback, his agreement, his additional ideas about further directions of reflection and analysis. And that's what led to this chapter. And luckily I met Marianne at a conference years ago as I think a first-year PhD student at the time. But I wanted to try out this chapter as a co-author experience with Junior about our different perspectives of the same partnership over 10 years. So that's why the chapter. I think my learnings, the findings we can all read later in many ways, but my learnings were, I learned things about our personal relationship and perspectives of the partnership that I hadn't learned over the last 12 years working together, even though we talk all the time, because there was this intentional analysis happening and frameworks, and it allowed us to view some of the same moments and stories that we've talked about and discussed for years in different ways, as moments of shifting between north-south relationships and how that happened. So I learned about our own personal relationship and partnership in a different way through the co-authorship experience. I saw a lot of the issues we all know are there about access because of language and other barriers. So even our theoretical frameworks, a lot wasn't available. He doesn't speak English. And so that was a challenge, both in terms of accessing scholarly sources, but also doing a lot of translation back and forth through authoring this chapter and checking translations and things. And my third learning was that it took a really long time. I could have written this chapter by myself in English in probably less than half the time it took us to go back and forth between languages, countries, different theoretical frameworks. And so when we look at the incentives, those of us who are employed by universities, it really becomes problematic, because I probably could have written 3 chapters instead of this 1 chapter if I hadn't embarked in kind of the messiness and the complications of co-authorship. But I think that's what I learned. That's why I learned from this process as well. So the questions I would leave us with are how, despite these kind of disincentives and barriers, do we and can we collectively work to facilitate these processes of broader conversations, of other voices, of other language, of access, even video, when you're in a place where internet's such poor quality that the video probably doesn't work from this filmed webinar, and how do we shift it into a podcast instead for download. So how do we facilitate those processes? And I think my main kind of takeaway and question I would pose is, my own personal learning from the organization is, if you don't tell your story, someone else will. It just might be a different story. And who has access to tell each of our stories and each of our partnership stories? And how might this story be different if we included more voices in an intentional way? I'll turn over to Gonzalo, I think is next.
Right. Hi there, everyone. I'm checking in from Montreal, from a hotel room in Montreal. I'm attending the Universities Canada North-South Student Mobility Symposium and presented some of my research yesterday. So this could not be more timely. And thank you for the opportunity to be together once again. Very briefly, because I'm going to be part of a webinar that Global SL is organizing on March 2nd. So this is just a teaser, but very briefly, I'll mention why I undertook the research I did, what I learned, and some questions I have. So before the mass movement of millions of people from the global north to the global south in popularized ISL, GSL, volunteer abroad, service learning, et cetera, exodus took place from the north to the south. I started Compañeros in 2001 after 15 years after a 15-year career in the classroom as an educator. And I wanted to take the classroom to the field, and I did that, and I started Compañeros in 2001 and started organizing and facilitating volunteer service and cross-cultural learning experiences for North Americans in primarily Nicaragua. And I did that on a part-time basis until about 2008, and then I did it on a full-time basis. I moved to Managua and centered my entire life around this work between 2009 and 2014. And it was during that period that I experienced what Elizabeth Dewar called, in a well-known article, cognitive dissonance around service learning. And I could not help struggle with the difference between the effectiveness of our projects. We're involved in education, health, housing, and water projects, and 15,000 beneficiaries. We were utilizing best practices intuitively in terms of employing local people, needs assessments based on locally driven community leaders and residents. We were doing a lot of things right, frankly, on the project side of things, and the results were indicating that. But on the other hand, the program participants, while they were congenial and well-intentioned and honest and open and learned a lot, I noticed could not articulate what they had learned when they returned to primarily Ontario. And when I did listen to those that could articulate themselves, what I noticed was that a lot of the benefits were what I now call mutual private benefits. In other words, they were individualized benefits, they were privatized benefits, they were benefits that helped advance the individual's personal growth and sense of place and character development, perhaps. But very few of the 1,300 participants we had worked with over the years could articulate any type of reciprocal public benefit. And so this concerned me, and it nagged at me for years in the back of my mind. And at the same time, I was horrified, frankly, at the explosion of organizations that were popping up, especially in Nicaragua, in the last 5 to 10 years, who were coming in and clearly were approaching this not from a pedagogically sound point of view, not from a community-centered point of view, but simply from either from a commercial point of view, or more often, even if it wasn't commercial, it was misguided in many ways. And there was just an explosion of this in Nicaragua, and I was horrified by that. So for those two reasons, I undertook my master's research project around the notion of standards of practice. What were and what are the best standards of practice in global service learning? And I will talk more about that on March 2nd in detail. But one of the key learnings from that research was that a lot of the demand for standards of practices are coming from intermediary organizations or third-party providers, or whatever you want to call them. And that was a bit of a surprise. It's not coming out of universities primarily, or colleges. It's not coming from the South. It's the intermediaries, the ones with integrity and deep interest in the educational and community aspects of these programs that are driving or raising some of the conversation around standards. So that was one learning. The other learning was what I've already mentioned, was this difference between mutual privatized benefits and reciprocal publicized benefits. And the mutual privatized benefits tended to be, as I mentioned, individualized, segregated, and expansive for the northern participants, and limited and short-term and somewhat superficial for the southern participants. Whereas reciprocal public benefit would have a lot more to do with citizen building, a lot more to do with capacity building in the South, and a lot more to do with the political, economic, social, technological, religious, cultural realities of local and global. So I'll elaborate on that in a couple of weeks' time, but those were the two main learnings about who's driving intermediaries, and delving into really what does people use the term mutual private benefit or mutual benefit, but what does that really mean, and what does reciprocal benefit or reciprocal public benefit, as I termed it, really mean. The questions that remain with me, well, there's a lot, and I think the first one to mention, because it's related directly to the work that Marianne assembled many of us around, is what defines the host? And this is a tricky question. Is the host everybody in our value chain in Nicaragua, from the service providers on the ground to the staff of intermediaries to the elected, appointed, and natural leaders of the community? Does it refer to the government agencies or the in-country NGOs that we partner with? What about host families? So where does one draw the line around what constitutes the host, and and therefore who would you be consulting with if you were in a South-centered organization? So that's definitely one big question I have. And the other one is, I have three. The second one is, are there standards in the Global South that do standards of practice exist in the Global South? I couldn't find any. Only one out of my 21 standards came from the Global South. Are there standards hidden there? And if there are, how can they be accessed? If there are not, how could they be developed? And the third and final question is, how, on the one hand, we are interested in, as practitioners and researchers, in disseminating information, Global SL being an exemplary example of this. But my next question is, how do we assemble this information so that we can really develop communities of practice that can start to share resources and collaborate to develop new resources? I think there's a tremendous amount of duplication and reinvention of the wheel going on with a lot of the materials around GSL at the moment. And how could we, it's a bit ironic, but localize some of these great learnings into maybe regional communities of practice that somehow involve North and South people. So those are some of the questions that I'm working with at the moment.
Great, thank you, Gonzalo. And as Gonzalo mentioned, the March 2nd, noon Eastern Standard Time webinar is on ethical frameworks of practice. Global. Gonzalo will be sharing more about his research. Philip Mudge from COLOV, the Irish organization, has really done wonderful work with international volunteering standards. We'll be presenting, and I'll be sharing the work I've been involved with, or actually Brandon Blash-Cohen will be sharing the work that we've been involved with on fair trade learning. There are documents and videos up right now on the blog post about that, so I'm not going to take any time on that. Gonzalo has a really awesome infographic, and COLOV and Global SL have each made videos around the frameworks, so please do take a look for a teaser in that space. We have 45 minutes left to get into conversation here, and I'm really thrilled about that. See some great questions hopping around, but I'm going to turn it over to Janice McMillan, who's joining us from the University of Cape Town in South Africa, and I'm looking forward to hearing how she'd like to start our conversation.
Yes, thanks, Eric, and thanks to everybody. It's been a very stimulating conversation. When reading through Marianne's introduction to the book, I was really struck by both the purpose and aims of the book itself, but also some of the concepts that were problematized in the book, namely community service, international service learning, that concept itself. And so initially tonight I thought I would maybe ask some questions around those concepts, which in the context where I work, and I've worked both with American students coming, as Eric said, I ran a required seminar for Stanford program in Cape Town over 5 years, dealing with hundreds of Stanford students coming in for a kind of a quarter break in Cape Town. But I'm based at the University of Cape Town, where I work more in the field of community engagement, trying to grapple with the issue of global citizenship and actually having trouble with that concept at the very moment. And perhaps given my location, how do we think about global in very unequal contexts? And I know I know Eric and others know some of my thoughts around that. So I was going to talk a little bit about that, and I can try and bring some of my context into the conversation. But I was also quite struck by the conversation that's happened. I thought maybe I would pick up on just a few things that stood out for me, and perhaps that can lead to a conversation. And the one was just we all struggling with the concept of service. So it's very clear in the literature that service is a troubling concept, and we struggle with it. And I'm also part of a European network of largely NGOs and a couple of government agencies that are trying to do sending young Europeans into many different contexts. And they take in the concept of global learning as the focus of these partnerships. And as much as students are interested in the exchanges, the network itself was trying to focus on the learning component of it. And I wonder what that would mean for global service learning if we focused much more on it being a learning exchange program, and how that would shift some of the paradigms. That's maybe just a question coming out of my own thinking. And the second, I suppose, is just really from my context. And there's an interesting website here, which is Africa as a Country. And it's a challenging website because it starts to ask the question about how do we differentiate not only countries in Africa, but countries in the global south. And is the global south an homogenous entity, and not all experiences, global north, global south? We can talk in very generic terms, and I myself have found myself using those terms. And I'm almost beginning to say maybe we need to step back a little bit and be more nuanced about, if we're talking about host communities in different contexts in the global south have had very different experiences, from colonial experiences in my context, apartheid experiences. So I suppose maybe it's a question to all of us to say, do we need to really think in more nuanced ways about our language? And I just have one more question that I wanted to put up, and it was partly coming out of Sam's thoughts, which was we talk a lot about working with the students and helping students to actually understand some of the complexities. And I want to know, what about the role of faculty, of educators, of the folk who design and set up and very often lead the programs? So how do we begin to maybe theorize an idea of boundary work and boundary workers, and what does it take to do that very complex work across boundaries? And that's from the perspective of the faculty or instructors who design the program. So I suppose those are just some of the questions sparked by the conversation now, as well as my own work. And I'm looking at you for some guidance as to how we put those into the conversation. And maybe some of the speakers could be the initial respondents to some of those questions. I'm not sure how you want to take it.
Sure. Well, and I've unmuted myself, and I've actually also unmuted Jessica Ahrens, Jessica, just permanently. So the other speakers, did anything strike you there? Or
this is Marianne. I think you're bang on, Janice, with your thoughts about service. I over the course of doing the research and putting the book together, there was a point at which I actually thought the best thing to do was actually to get rid of the service piece, the service component altogether. And I wrote a paper about that and presented it at a conference. But then as the book progressed and the chapters were coming in, it became very clear that the hosts, either as participants in research studies or authors, certainly were not saying don't send the students. That was not a message that was coming through at all, despite some of the problems with these programs. But they were saying we need to emphasize the learning piece, not to do away with the service part, but to emphasize the learning piece. And they really wanted to be considered co-educators, that we need to go into these programs realizing that they are there to teach our students, ourselves as facilitators, third-party providers, everybody involved, as much as they are to learn as well. So this notion of being a co-educator came through very clearly, and that was something new for me. I hadn't thought about that, so I just wanted to share that.
I mean, I can just respond very briefly to that. I think that's exactly the point, is perhaps not to remove it, but to problematize it and to challenge it, and to try and find ways around it. And I've begun to use the concept of learning service as one way around it, so not to assume that we are able to serve. We know what service involves in different contexts, and so I think that's something that is quite a useful, maybe a point to have a really robust discussion around, specifically focusing on the service component.
Well, I'll jump in here because Compañeros became a service learning organization precisely because we saw firsthand the negative effects of educational groups, people, adults actually, from higher educational institutions coming to Nicaragua, meeting with people in the spirit of solidarity and learning lots. Of course, being personally moved by people's stories, their knowledge being expanded, etc. However, on more than one occasion, the local people with whom they were working, or the people from whom they were learning, the Nicaraguans from whom the Canadians were learning, would say, "And now what?" And so for me, the question is not whether or not there's service. The question is how the service is done. I think it's disingenuous to suggest that there's nothing like, and I'm not saying that you are suggesting this, but having ruminated over this for more than a decade, perhaps closer to 2, it's disingenuous for North Americans, for people with privilege, to go to an underprivileged place and say they have nothing to contribute. And furthermore, if people in this global, and people in Nicaragua, and I think your point about the nuance in what we mean when we talk about global south is excellent. So I will speak from the Nicaraguan perspective. When you ask people in Nicaragua, do you want these Canadian groups to stop service, that they will almost 100% say, are you like, no, are you kidding? That's definitely part of the equation. Thirdly, as a teacher, and this is where the setup, the standards of practice come into play, are so necessary, because the service is a vehicle for the learning. So the problems with service happen if the North Americans enter the situation thinking that they're the ones in charge and they're the ones who know what to do. And any service setup like that is doomed to fail. But with an intermediary organization, or with a capable volunteer community-based organization, or the combination of both, where the community is in charge of what's going, not only in terms of the needs assessment, but also in terms of identifying and selecting laborers who are paid by the participants' fees, who are trained not only to do the work from a skill-based point of view, but who are also trained to, here's how you bring some North American volunteers into this education or health or housing or water project and do it together. That's very powerful, because the power dynamic is turned upside down and stereotypes are disrupted immediately, because the local Nicaraguan worker is in charge of this crew of Canadian grunt workers, and that's rich ground for learning. It's very empowering and affirming for the local skilled labor and leaders, and it results in our case in very tangible positive products. So all that a long way of saying, I think we're asking the wrong question when we say service or not service, or learning or not learning, or what the ratio is. It's how these things are done. It's what standards are employed by all the stakeholders to affect these the processes and outcomes that we desire.
One thing I wanted to loop back to a comment I saw Janice put into the chat box kind of very early on, and I'm thinking as we talk about service, I hear Gonzalo use, it sounds like if we think just about learning, we might lose some of the participating in activities together, which enables one-on-one interaction in a way that a group class or something doesn't, which I think often is how service is implemented in some of these partnerships. I think what becomes problematic is service connotes in outcomes or impacts that are often claimed, many times even in marketing materials and written by university actors. And I hear that kind of participating in activities together, this kind of, but Janice brought up the term accompaniment, and I wonder, and that was Junior, who was my co-author, who's a Brazilian, and very much based in kind of liberation theology, as in terms of how he comes to this work. We use that kind of theology of accompaniment to shift away from kind of this desire to claim outcomes and impacts, but to still be able to quote unquote work together, participate in activities together and still have those one-on-one interactions that in our specific context seem very vital to that learning. The other thing that really resonated with me, Janice, and I'm thinking out loud here, I should have like my thoughts formulated, but that essentializing of the Global South and the importance of context. And I keep coming back to context, but I'll say thank you, because my personal reflection was, even my presentation about the chapter, it wasn't about the findings, it was about how we went about writing the chapter together. And some feedback I'm getting on my dissertation right now is you're privileging too much or foregrounding too much the process of how you went about this as opposed to the findings. And I think that what you're hitting on is maybe just that, because I don't know that the findings are going to be the same in Managua, where Gonzalo works, as the region of Nicaragua with the specific community organization with whom we partner. And I think this kind of desire for just having concrete findings and lists of standards and things sometimes is really difficult to generalize, whereas the how we go about improving and pursuing ethical engagements is defined by context. So I don't know if that makes sense, but you definitely gave me some food for thought, Janice, with that.
Janice, I really resonate with how you brought up the ability potentially of the facilitators from the universities or the programs that are really, taking people or calling people like Gonzalez and say, hey, do you mind taking us down to Nicaragua? What's interesting to me in my professional and personal life, getting a chapter in a book really ups your street cred. People ask you for advice when you're not necessarily ready to give it to them. People ask me all the time, I know this is a complicated subject. I don't have the confidence to ask the right questions. I'm a teacher. I'm a single mom, but I want to organize this trip. I've been tasked to organize this trip as a professional. Who should I go with? What should I do? How do I know that they're doing it right? Right. And part of the questions that I'm left with is gathering more information. I mean, I could call up, Gonzalo and say, hey, I've got this group of people who are looking for a program. But again, this is a mentality that I'm finding, in my sort of circles, is I don't want to squash the flame of young engagement, but who do we go to, right? And how do we coach people towards the right third-party providers, under the assumption that even, it's not going to change, right? Like, people are still going to go. And in terms of people who are, like Gonzalo, are taking students, and many of you here taking students or participants down on these programs, I really do feel that a huge part of success of these programs really does have to do with that facilitator and how they are facilitating that journey and those debriefs, not only with the participants, with people, you know, of the host communities. I feel like I have to put every word in quotations, sorry. But that facilitator can make or break the learning that these students or participants are coming back with. And it is a question for me is you know, how do we educate the messiness, but not instill action paralysis with people who are wanting to do this? And I wrote a chapter as like a young master's student with a professor of mine about going too deep, too dark, too fast, and sort of you know, a young TA with a lot of responsibility saying, hey, go and teach a few of these courses, starting off as, you know, shock value, very radical focus, to 3 years later going and teaching the same lesson in a very different way, and sort of, you know, reflected on my experiences of what worked a little bit better in terms of changing the mentality of go save the world. And it is a question. It's a great question. How are we helping to educate or involve facilitators in this conversation in a way that is going to help participants along that journey of a higher level consciousness, but not, you know, making them stop in their tracks and say, this is too difficult. And I think that's a really interesting thing to bring up.
I mean,
Eric?
a number of...
Someone said my name. Who is that?
Marianne,
Yes.
is it okay to talk now?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. I just wanted to follow up on some of the comments that have been made. It's such a good conversation, and there's just so much to say. Sam, when they come to you and ask what should they do, and I'm not saying this just to plug the book, but honestly, I think the findings in the book and the message that comes through in the chapters, which are very context specific, I think it's really important for people to read, not because I care about selling the book. I couldn't care less about that. But I think that the research that's come out, the voices, what the hosts in various communities have to say, I think it's essential for anybody who is planning an ISL, GSL trip. So I just wanted to put that out there. And there was a couple of things that I wanted to follow up from Nora's talk. Nora, I'm really glad that you brought up liberation theology, because when I was initially feeling very critical about the notion of service and problematizing it, Alison Larkin, another author in the book, had a discussion with me about liberation theology and how that informs her thinking around international service learning. And it's a very different way of thinking about service. And you mentioned accompaniment, and then I'm thinking about Gonzalo's organization called Compañeros and this notion of being a co-educator. It's about and I don't know quite how to articulate this, but thinking about service in the context of walking a path with somebody else together, and that walking, that process needs to take place right the way through, from the pre-planning stages through to the experience of the walk itself, so to speak, and afterwards reflecting on it too. And then the other piece.
Marianne, could I?
Sure, go ahead.
Jump in with a question or comment there that relates. I've been really interested in listening to how we're, as a field, we've probably been struggling with the idea of service and learning as some kind of dichotomy for, you know, as long as the phrase has existed. And of course, now we're moving past the phrase in general. But a lot of this, and Nora's work as well, make it, and looking at Gutierrez and Paul Farmer and some others, might it make sense to think about accompaniment as a development outcome, in the sense that quality, community-driven development may well be impossible without deep relationship that is sufficiently deep enough to be in places of enough empathy and co-understanding that things actually are co-designed? I wonder if Nora has thoughts on this too. It just seems that a lot of what we see that comes out of the community-driven development lit presumes that there's this quality of relationship. But if we can't get a lot of the skills that we often list on the student-centered side of things, if we can't get those skills that create capacities for accompaniment, which I don't even think empathy is a good enough word to signify the kind of accompaniment that Gustavo Gutierrez or Paul Farmer write about, then it's hard to get into significantly community-driven, shared perspective kind of work.
Why do you think it should be an outcome as opposed to a process? I'm assuming you're thinking about accompaniment in terms of both a process and an outcome?
Well, I guess I'm in general trying to find a way past the, we seem to get hung up again and again on, air quotes here, not being able to point to outcomes, or getting frustrated because things are all process or all learning. And in a way, learning looks like it's very focused on the visitor individuals and doesn't seem equitable. But if people are there, and in fact, because they're concerned with, they're concerned in relationship, at least if Gonzalo's narrative is right, there's people concerned in the local community about a set of development outcomes, and there's people coming from the north because naively they think they have some probably an over-imagined idea of what difference they might make. For them to really cooperate together well, there's an ingredient that's essential, in that process. And I'm just playing with an idea here, which again, I want to encourage everyone to do in the...
Eric, let me try to see if I'm understanding you right. Maybe this will help, because it sounds like there was a little confusion. What it's making me think of is if we acknowledge, now this was coming out of how we define outcomes, right? And we like to define them often for marketing purposes around, X number of beneficiaries reached and all the things I completely understand as someone who has to do fundraising and grant applications. But when I asked that question to community residents and partner organization representatives and some of the folks living in Musselal, Nicaragua, the outcomes were also things like awareness, like an access to a network for advocacy if there was injustice happening, or it was confianza or trust or relationships. And we all like to say we all say this in the literature, right? Relationships are crucial for any ISL partnership. I think there's kind of at some point, whether we have the evidence or not, wide recognition of that. But it's often only viewed as the kind of intermediary piece as opposed to acknowledged as an outcome, because we make planning and programming decisions in order to reach outcomes. And if it's not acknowledged as an outcome, we may not make our programming decisions prioritizing the actions that we'll need and decisions that we need to make to reach that outcome. Am I making sense, Eric? I'm thinking out loud. So if we say relationships are important, otherwise partnerships don't work, we say it and we say we have to have a lot of interaction, okay, moving forward. But if the College of Engineering, for example, that I work with is looking at outcomes only as things like access to clean drinking water, access to mobile health care, solar panels, decisions about trip priorities, time spent in community, what activities are spent on, how long you spend doing different activities, are based on access to mobile health care, are based on number of solar panels, as opposed to based on the outcome of developing trust or relationships or awareness. I'll stop talking. I'll leave it there.
Maybe, can I see if I understand you, Nora? I mean, I think, are you not also getting at how we define development? Because I think that, development isn't a topic that I see very much in service learning curricula from the Global North, for instance, and the Global South, to use those terms now. Development is something really on our lips all the time because it's perceived that the Global South is in need of development, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it's about how do we define development? Is development about, tangible outcomes, or is it about relationships that transcend those outcomes? And I think we need to have a conversation. And Eric, you raised, development as a concept. And I know that it's in your work. And I think when I have taught students coming from the US and Cape Town about development, they're quite surprised to have that discourse in the course that I'm teaching, because they assume the static outcome and they don't understand the complexity of being a development practitioner. What does development mean in developing context? And I think that's a term that we don't use often enough. And I think we should prize it open from personal development, community development, whatever, international development, global development. So I'd like to, at some point in the conversation, really put pressure on the concept of development as something that we don't do enough of.
Well, that's very much where my question or comment came from, in a sense. I've been exposed to recently, I guess, increasing amounts of energy from large volunteer sending organizations or initiatives that are interested in aligning themselves with sustainable development goals. The MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals, have the language of partnership very present within them, as do the SDGs. And I'm just wondering if there's and so many organizations support, at least in name, the idea of community-driven development, but perhaps what we're dancing around here is getting toward a more systematic understanding of the way in which personal transformation is bound up with the capacity to really achieve anything. I find it hard to understand how we get to without some real depth on the student learning side of what we talk about. And of course, as you mentioned, Janice, I am very passionate about the community development side, and also frustrated by the ways the discourses seem to not intertwine sufficiently. I see some really interesting, I see some content going on in the chat space. Is there anything we should be looking toward, Noel?
Yeah, actually, there's a couple of questions that have come up in terms of, well, what are the economic impacts? And then Chris has just posted an interesting question, and I think it maybe touches on something that I wonder if a few people are wrestling with. The scholarly piece of me, I'm loving the conversations about the conceptual frameworks and the definitions and how do we understand this. As I understand it, I think some folks are maybe on the practitioner side, and I think are loving these sorts of conversations, but then also are thinking, well, hey, but I have got 200 students going abroad this summer, and how do I begin to put these sorts of things into practice? And I wonder if there's thoughts in terms of actionable items of how do we begin to change some of the momentum and direction of these programs so that we're not a part of the problem and just keep doing things the same way that we've been doing them, whether it's at an institutional level, whether it's in our partnerships, whether it's how we prepare students or communities. I wonder if folks at any point here have ideas or things that they've seen that work well.
I have some ideas.
Mm-hmm. So do I. Mm-hmm. Go ahead. So,
do you want to go ahead, Gonzalo?
No, you start, please.
I actually think it's not as difficult as everybody's making it out to seem. There's a lot of good templates out there and good best practices, and I have to admit, getting a little tired hearing people saying I don't know what to do. First of all, Gonzalo's and Eric's standards of practice frameworks, I think they're exemplary. Nothing's perfect. Everything needs to take into account the specific context, but those would be a really great starting point. And Gonzalo, I understand on the chat you just posted another one that's out there. So there's some really good frameworks that have been developed as a starting point. The second thing is, to develop these programs and to do them well and facilitate them, it simply takes time. And to assume that you can just have a checklist and plan these in a couple of weeks without doing the hard work that comes with relationship building that takes years, I think is very problematic. So, I mean, there's the easy piece, so to speak, where you have these frameworks and you can look to those and use those as a way to think about your programming. But the other piece is simply going to take some time. That's all I have to say. Thank you.
Well, to add to that, I would, my next step, as I mentioned in my introduction, is I think there's an intermediate step between the number of frameworks that are out there and the time required to iterate and reiterate these. And that intermediate step is what I was referring to when I talked about regional gatherings. I wasn't specific. It could be web-based, but I think actually I know from having talked with, in particular, campus-based people for the last 3 months. I know that there's a demand, at least in Ontario, for frontline workers. And what I mean by that is people in colleges and universities who are staffed in the international offices, who are the ones receiving these hordes of students coming to them saying, I want to A, B, or C. They're under tremendous pressure, not only on a daily basis from students, but from universities to double their numbers in the next 5 years of people who are engaged in internationalization. Only about it's arguable, but 5 to 10% of all international activity is actually north-south related. But that 5 to 10% is itself a significant number of people, a volume of people in the United States and Canada relative to the sizes of the organizations that are asked to organize these. And so it's difficult. I'm empathetic, having spent time on campus and advising folks to the pressures that they face to pull all this together, especially in the U.S., where the numbers are I think, larger than the numbers we're used to dealing with in Canada. And so building on Global SL, I would like to see, and I'm actually in the midst of organizing an Ontario-based webinar and gathering in the spring or fall that will serve the needs of those frontline practitioners who say, okay, how do I take these frameworks that fair trade learning or my 6 standards of practice, or the great stuff that's come out of Ireland, or the good stuff that's coming out of Breakaway in Atlanta, how do I take these frameworks and actually enact them? And I mentioned that the first part of my career was in the classroom as a teacher, and the second part of my career has become increasingly interested in teaching teachers and training trainers. And obviously that's a circular dynamic because I still have lots to learn. But my point being that I think there's an intermediate step needed that would serve these frontline folks who have to deal with increasing numbers of people going overseas who know that they need to instill these standards better. So that's that, and my reference to some other resources is my immediate answer.
Yeah, I would like to chime in just very briefly as well. This is Jessica. I would say from the practitioner side of things, for people looking for, ways to really bolster programs, make them more robust, make the partnerships more ethical, I really think we can't overemphasize enough the importance of somehow collecting feedback. So somehow developing some sort of evaluation. And I think, as Marianne mentioned, people can sort of get caught up in what that means. And, we can become kind of obsessed with getting like the best sort of rubric or the best framework to work with. But just getting out there and asking people, how's the program going? Just very simply, it can be very revealing as to how people are experiencing this, both on the student side and the community partner side. And I know from looking at the research, faculty often drive this whole process. So that's why I decided to go into faculty development, to really make sure that things like evaluation are on their radar from the very beginning, because so much time is consumed with the logistics and, developing the course and just getting the ball rolling. Evaluation is often forgotten about or just tacked on at the end. So I would definitely say, look at some of the questionnaires, the surveys that are out there, but not leaving off that important step of somehow being able to ask just very broadly, how are things going, so that what you think is happening either is or is not happening.
And Gonzalo is getting ready to share a great resource, working side by side.
I'm so happy to know Shoshana Sumka is on the line. I was just started to read this on the plane the other day. And so this is Working Side by Side, Creating Alternative Breaks as Catalyst for Global Learning, Student Leadership and Social Change by Shoshana, Melody, and who I think is also on the call, and Jill. So I didn't know you were part of the call, so perhaps you could share some of your insights.
If you do, you'll have to.
Hi, I don't know if my mic is working. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, great. Hi, everybody. So, yeah, I mean, the research is really important, and we're so glad to see that people are looking at host community impacts, because that's something that we've really been working on for a long time. And this book, The Working Side by Side, is a result of practitioners writing down everything that we've been doing to put this into practice in running programs. So it talks about how you move from, the typical top-down, oh, we're here to serve you kind of model, to working side by side together with community members, looking at the relationship piece, and really looking at root causes. How do we address the issues that lead to the need, these unequal situations? How do you address the issues of discrimination and marginalization, and how do you build solidarity around collective action and working together with community organizing and community-based groups who are fighting for some of these issues around racial justice, around women's rights, around human rights, and how do we encourage students at the university level to get involved with those organizations? As Sam quoted the Lila Watson one, we're all in this together, and how do we provide a framework for students to not be paralyzed, but to see that there are real concrete steps that they can take. So it talks about 8 core components of the program. Gosh, I wish my camera's on, I can show you my book too. But it talks about the 8 core components of running a program, looking at from the pre-trip orientation, training, skills building, looking at diversity and social justice, working, tips on working in mutually beneficial partnerships with communities, making sure that you address the issues of alcohol and drug abuse, which is a real issue in the international programs, how you do reflection and synthesize learning, and then when you come back home, how do you reorient students and take that learning into solidarity and action. So it's real accessible and easy to read. It's aimed for practitioners and student leaders.
Just thank you, Shoshana. And it is really exciting for the field to see such great books, the book we're talking about today, as well, coming out recently. And of course, Working Side by Side came out of the breakaway movement and alternative breaks. It's really relevant well beyond that as well. And international service learning really is particularly unique in terms of, I think, its engagement with post-colonial lit, and also its diversity of authors. Really appreciate that. I have a brief reflection, but Marianne, I wondered, one question I'm going to ask you in just a second, I'll give you a moment to think about it, is in the closing chapter, you suggest that we have to have a paradigm shift. And I wonder if you could speak a little bit about that, what paradigm shift you're looking toward or hoping for. But thanks, Janice, for this recent question. How do we get faculty to understand they have to engage the personal side of this work? I just want to mention, literally this morning, I was had a conversation with a colleague, and we were honoring how awesome Breakaway and the Working Side by Side work is in terms of engaging students. And it led to a discussion where many of us are trying not only to engage students, but actually to work to get faculty to understand that they have to do the same processes in terms of personalizing their relationship with hegemonic narratives and power and privilege and intersectionality if they're going to ethically and be involved with these programs. So these strengths are really coming together in the field as we see a lot of great books coming out. I appreciate everyone's contributions here. Marianne, you had what's the paradigm shift?
Thanks. I'm glad I have a chance to talk a little bit about that. Thanks, Eric. Simply put, the paradigm shift is shifting the host communities, host members into the center. And that Again, it's simple in a way, and it's also complex, and it's context dependent. But in all the planning and facilitating and post-planning stages, it is absolutely essential, I believe, to center the opinions, values, voices, call it what you want, of the members of the community where the students are going. And to do that, the shift that needs to take place is that we need to go, when I'm saying we, I'm talking about those of us in the Global North participating or facilitating these programs, go into these initiatives recognizing, as I think it was Sam who pointed out, our vulnerability, and also to go in with a very deep sense of humility, that there is so much more that we don't know compared to what we do know. And if we enter these relationships, and they are relationships, with that firmly in our minds, a sense of not knowing, a sense of being humble, and being vulnerable and being open, pretty amazing things can happen in that moment of connection. And I turn to the work of a philosopher called Emmanuel Levinas, and he talks about the ethics of responsibility that come with developing relationships, and how through developing relationships based on an ethics of responsibility, our own subjectivity arises. We better understand who we are, but that cannot happen without an acknowledgement of our of what we don't know, and our vulnerability. So that's the paradigm shift that I'm talking about.
Great. Thank you very much, Marianne. I feel I should mention a few things before we run out of time. First of which is, I really appreciate the contributions here and the contributions in the chat space. It's a little bit frustrating trying to figure out how to pack in so many different issues and conversations in an hour and a half. And a reminder for me of how important it is that we do find ways to get together and support one another's thinking when we're not together at conferences, where I have the good fortune to see each other at some of the conferences in this field. Someone asked about the particular dates when I mentioned the International Service Learning Summit. That's October 23rd to 25th. More information is at globalsl.org/ISL4. And Noel shared that earlier, I believe. Thank you for doing that. I did want to share that and Vicky, I'll also follow up with your question after the webinar. One of the things that we hear again and again, and Gonzalo surfaced this, the amount of pressure that's put onto administrators, faculty, staff, even students, pressure on students. If you don't have international experience, you're not likely to blank, 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 succeed in the world, be a successful what have you. A lot of people really are looking for an ally space where there's a coalition saying, okay, we believe in global partnership, we really do. It's just very clear from the research and the diversity of narratives around the world that there are a set of things that are necessary to do this well. And they often take a bit more time and intentionality. Global SL really would like to facilitate an ally space for people who are doing that. We're seeing more and more products developed, and we'll continue to share them. I just saw something that someone developed at IUPUI, a one-pager to be shared across the institution about best practices. Because at an institutional level, there's 27,000 people out my window over here who are rather unaware of, 24 are very aware of our conversations, but most are rather unaware. So how do we communicate that out? We're working on that question and would really love additional ideas and resources. Again, we'd like to share all of those things. I just want to say thank you again for everyone coming today. If you are interested in the ethical frameworks conversation, that's on March 2nd, and the registration form is up. And I hope also that we might see you at the International Service Learning Summit. There's probably also going to be a Bowling Green State University in a regional gathering in the Ohio area or mid-May, May 16 to 18, for anyone that might apply to. Thanks so much for the authors and for the discussants making time today to be part of this. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Eric.
It's been wonderful.
Thank you. It will be posted online as well, the recording and information from it.
Thanks very much, Eric.
Mhm.